If you've watched some of my more recent uploads, you'll probably know I've got quite the fondness for the concept of speed in video games. Not only that, but as a kid during the mid-2000s, I was also a pretty big fan of the Hot Wheels brand, and I was delighted to find out that there have actually been a pretty decent number of racing games using that license. What's even more surprising is that a good few of them are actually pretty solid games, which can seldom be said about most products of this type. Now, if you've been on the internet for any amount of time and are even slightly interested in video games, then you've probably heard of the cinematic masterpiece known as Ride to Hell Retribution. Yeah, well, what if I told you that the people behind it were also responsible for one of my favorite games donning the Hot Wheels brand? To be fair, said game came out a good 6 years prior to their magnum opus, so it might not have actually been the same group of people. Regardless, Hot Wheels Beat That is the game I want to talk about today and explain why, all nostalgia aside, and in spite of the developer's reputation, I still go back to this game and enjoy it just as much as I did back when it released.
3, 2, 1, go!
Just looking at the footage, I think it goes without saying that Hot Wheels Beat That is an arcade racer with a handling model to match. Simply driving around is extremely simple, with your cars feeling quite light but also surprisingly grippy for an arcade game. That's not to say that drifting has been completely omitted. As is typical for the genre, this action has a dedicated button to it, but what's not so typical is the way in which drifting itself works. See, in most arcade racers, drifting is often treated as almost a separate driving mode entirely, where upon hitting the dedicated button, your car automatically goes sideways. All you gotta worry about is not overcorrecting your course. In Beat That, however, all the drift button does is decrease your car's grip to the point of making drifting possible in the first place, but the actual act of drifting is still up to the player. This is probably the single aspect that sets the driving in this game apart from other games of its kind, as it introduces a certain level of skill required to successfully drift around corners while keeping your speed up. Now, for the most part, the track design doesn't necessitate drifting, although there are still benefits to doing so as frequently as possible. Another mechanic that you won't see too often in arcade racers is this game's rival system. Now, the game itself doesn't do much to explain how the system really works, but I think I've worked it out just by playing. Basically, any opponent that manages to land a hit on you is labeled as your rival, and if you're able to get your revenge on him, as the game puts it, you're rewarded with extra points. As is arcade racer tradition, Hot Wheels Beat That features an assortment of power-ups serving as either offense or defense. Before I can even talk about them, I just want to mention the way in which they're obtained. See, you may have noticed these yellow, blue, and green rings of fire placed around the stages. These essentially serve as your item boxes and speed boosters, but there's a little more to it. The blue ones are usually in tougher to reach spots, since those ones give you powered up versions of the standard weapons, encouraging track memorization. The lineup is mostly standard. You've got your shields, rockets, zappy things straight out of Revolt, and speed boosts. Although there are a number of items that stand out as pretty original, like the parachutes to slow down any opponent it latches onto, or the ice weapon that locks up your steering, and perhaps the most unique, the EMP, which temporarily disables your current weapon. On their own, the power-ups are nothing groundbreaking, but if you've been paying attention to the footage, you may have noticed that big Hot Wheels logo in the corner. That's not just there for brand association, but rather it represents how full your supercharge meter is. This mechanic is why I mentioned that you're going to want to be drifting and doing other such maneuvers such as drafting, jumps, and touchdowns as often as possible. The points you receive throughout the race go towards building that bar up, and once filled, can be used to supercharge your current weapon, granting you a secondary method of acquiring weapons you'd normally only get from the harder to reach blue rings. The benefits of this are sometimes as simple as giving you more uses of the same item, but it can also enhance a weapon's properties entirely. Take the missiles for example. Once powered up, they essentially turn into red shells, homing in on the closest target. I think my favorite example of this is the EMP, which goes from simply disabling your items to destroying them entirely. Despite the potential frustration this can cause, I'm actually a huge fan of this concept because it forces you to use your weapons as wisely and as quickly as possible, since there's always the chance you might lose them. As a kid, I would always just use whatever item I received in any arcade racer as soon as I got it, but it was this game that taught me the benefits of holding onto an item for a little bit longer. And that's my awkward segue into talking about Hot Wheels Beat That's track design, which might just be the game's greatest strength. So I just mentioned holding onto your item for a little bit longer, right? Well, that's because the game is a pretty different way of handling shortcuts and alternate pathways. Instead of them just being out in the open for anyone to take, most shortcuts are blocked off with these red barriers, which can be broken using the appropriate amount of firepower. That's why you're going to want to hold off on using that bottle rocket you got earlier in the same lap. This seems rather trivial in a way, but I feel like this approach to alternate pathways does two things for the game as a whole. One, it adds that sense of exploration and mystery cursory to what is otherwise a completely linear experience. Especially when you're a kid, finding a previously unexplored section of a familiar track is like going on its own little adventure. And 2, although it's not very noticeable on the lower difficulties, the AI can also use these shortcuts, meaning that while you may gain an advantage from unlocking one, it has the potential to also be used against you. Okay, so the game has a unique way of handling shortcuts, but what about the actual track layouts? Well, this might just be my nostalgia, but I honestly feel that these tracks are still extremely fun to race on. All of them strike that perfect arcade racer balance between roller coaster and actual track, if that makes any sense. You've got loops, corkscrews, zigzags, and other such Hot Wheels shenanigans, but you've also got some more traditional track sections which require optimal cornering and control of your speed. And what ties these layouts together is the way they're presented. So as you might be aware, Hot Wheels Unleashed came out semi-recently and was a pretty good modern arcade racer. I can't deny I had plenty of fun with it, frustrating car unlocks aside, but playing the game, there was just this feeling that I couldn't shake, and you know what it was? That feeling of an empty void you get with game maps that are expansive but not very populated. Don't get me wrong, the game is graphically gorgeous and surprisingly well optimized on PC, but playing Beat That again really drove home the point how much more important detail is in relation to scale. Okay, so what am I on about exactly? Well, the point I'm trying to make is that Beat That's tracks captivate me not only from a gameplay standpoint, but a visual one. Everything is so densely packed and brimming with life. You got all these animated, inanimate objects to give the game that sense of childlike, my toys have come alive type wonder, and there's a great sense of scale and elevation to the tracks. In terms of visual theming, it's what you'd expect from a toy-based racing game. An ordinary household, an attic filled with science equipment for some reason, a bowling alley, and the one that stands out for me the most, the mini golf area. This one's easily my favorite because the developers clearly took advantage of the creative freedom such a theme presented, and the result is 4 tracks that are completely visually distinct, unlike in the remaining areas where variety between tracks is rather modest. Even from a purely graphical standpoint, this game has aged rather well, with detailed car models, bright colors, and lighting effects. The only downside is the slight overuse of bloom, but for 2007, this is far from the worst example of this. There's also plenty of particles and stylized speed line effects for when you're jumping, drifting, or drafting an opponent, and the points that get added to your supercharge meter are somewhat visually represented by these flaming spheres that fly out of your own and your opponent's vehicles. Lastly, as far as visual presentation goes, I especially like the way your car interacts with certain parts of the environment, like how it rumbles left and right when driving past a speaker, or the trails it leaves behind when going through paint, or driving over certain materials. Onto the audio presentation, it's once again pretty polished for the kind of game that this is, with aggressive engine whines whenever you hit a boost ring and satisfying clicks and pops for collisions and amassing points. There's also this announcer dude who narrates almost every gameplay related thing that happens, and maybe it's just me, but unlike most game narration, which I immediately turn off, his lines never really get on my nerves, although that might be because I've been playing this game for so long that I almost don't even register them as words and rather just hear them as sound cues. And you know me, I can't not bring up the background music. While Beat That's OST may not be the most instrumentally varied, with the only exception being the attic area, the actual songs here are really catchy and rarely give off any cheesiness. You've got some unironically heavy, hardcore, metalcore, and nu metal inspired tracks for the bedroom area, some more traditional punk rock and easycore of all things for the mini golf area. To the uninitiated, easycore is essentially just a heavier subgenre of pop punk, think Newfound Glory or Chunk No Captain Chunk. The attic area is the aforementioned odd one out with its more electronic-centric music, and while it has its moments of weirdness, it doesn't shy away from the more pop-infused chord progressions and melodies. Lastly, the bowling area sports an alternative rock sound with lots of 7th chords, distorted arpeggios, and bass grooves that I've seen compared to some Chili Pepper songs, but what those people are usually referring to is just that 5 to 6 bounce that is extremely common in not just funk, but really any guitar-centric music since it's really easy to play and sounds cool. While I think the OST on the whole is great stuff, one of my gripes with it is the use of these kind of corny vocal samples for some of the songs. It works for one of the mini golf songs since it creates some interesting intervals relative to the bass notes, but for the rest it just comes off as unnecessary. Finally, I just have to mention the fact that if you play this game on PC, you're only ever gonna hear one of the 16 tracks. Yeah, I don't know if it was to cut down on file sizes or what, but the PC version only ever plays one of the bedroom area tracks, and since I played that version growing up, that octave tritone intro is now permanently etched into my brain. If you were to play this on PC, please just turn the music down and play the OST off YouTube or something. Now, it's time to talk about the make or break for most single-player racing game experiences, the progression. On that front, Hot Wheels Beat That takes a very old-school approach in the sense that there's no plot or cutscenes or any RPG elements like Pro Street or Race Driver Grid. Instead, progression throughout the campaign is done by simply completing races in various game modes. Okay, by various, I may be being a bit generous. Aside from the standard quick race and tournament, you've only got Eliminator and Rampage. Eliminator is exactly what you'd expect going in from other racing games. You've got a ticking timer, and whoever's in last place when it hits 0 is knocked out. Now, Rampage is a little different, as instead of driving as fast as possible, your job is to destroy a certain number of AI driving around the track. I'm not sure if what I'm about to mention was intended by the developers or not, but I noticed that the way the AI cars were spread out encourages accuracy over speed, since if you were to miss an opponent and just move on to the next to try again, you might not have enough time as they'll be halfway across the track. Again, not sure if this was intended, but I do appreciate the fact that you're at least somewhat encouraged to change up your driving style, at least for this one event type. Moving on to something that I'm still not sure how to feel about regarding the game's pacing. As you might expect, there are 3 difficulty modes, as per standard, but unlike most games, not just racers, where most, if not all difficulties are available from the start, in Hot Wheels Beat That, you're only allowed to choose the easy difficulty at first and have to unlock the other 2 via game progression. I think I might have a guess as to why this is the case. First, this is obviously a game aimed at a very young demographic, so they probably didn't want little kids accidentally picking the hardest difficulty at the start and getting destroyed. You know, that I get, but I feel the other reason might have been with slightly less good intentions. Padding. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at it. They've even made most of the best cars unlocked by completing the main and secondary objectives of all 3 difficulties, meaning that if you want that power bomb or speed bump, you're gonna have to put a lot of time in. Now, I just mentioned that there are secondary objectives, and this too is one of the more standout additions to the game. I guess to help alleviate the monotony of just doing race after race with little change apart from scenery and the Rampage events, the devs decided to have you complete tasks other than just coming first. These can range from just getting a certain amount of points, which obviously incentivizes mastery of the drift mechanics, to something more specific like interacting with the environment a certain way, or using a specific item in a designated spot on the track. I must say this is actually a really clever idea, and it really helps in the long run since it gives you something to look forward to other than just unlocking new cars. And that's pretty much it for Hot Wheels Beat That, at least about going crazy in depth and wasting another hour of your time. It's really not too dissimilar to other games of its kind, although it does have its defining features. So is my love for this game mostly built upon nostalgia? Well, yes and no. Obviously the fact that I grew up with it helps, but there are actually a pretty decent number of games I grew up with that I just can't go back to, either because of outdated design, technical issues, or janky controls. Games like Midtown Madness with its wonky driving physics and damage model, Tank Racer with its AI, Counter-Strike 1.6 because it just bores me to tears now after having played Unreal Tournament, and even Minecraft for its overwhelming open-endedness. Unlike those games, I can still load this one up, pick a track and a car, and just do some racing that feels pretty satisfying. And while there were better racers out at the time like Dirt or Pro Street, Beat That still offers its own flavor of arcade fun, and going back to it is rather effortless. So yeah, that was my look back at a childhood favorite, which to this day I still can't believe was made by the same people who would go on to make Ride to Hell. Seriously, how did that happen? Anyway, thanks for sticking around, and I'll definitely try and keep future projects around this length for a while, for both my own and your sake as well.